Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on career development and international organizations. We have with us today Arnold Pronto, who is the Principal Legal Advisor at the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. My name is Maria Georgesca, and I'm the co-chair of the New Professionals Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. My co-chair and I, Patricia Cruz, and I decided to make this webinar because of the interest of the New Professionals Interest Group in career in international organizations. So in our interest group, we're trying to bring together practitioners, scholars, and government officials who are working in the field of international law, and by bringing them together, we're trying to establish a community of international lawyers who are who support each other in every aspect of career development. Therefore, we're very happy that we have today Mr. Arnold Pronto with us, who is going to share with us his experience at the UN, his career, his day-to-day work, and perhaps give some of the some members who are interested in working for the UN advice how to work at the UN. So Mr. Pronto is, as I said, the Principal Legal Advisor at the Office of the Legal Affairs of the UN. He is working primarily in the field of codification and progressive development of international law. He has assisted in negotiation of international treaties and contributed to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. He is also assisting the International Law Commission since 1999 and is teaching and publishing in the field of international law. Mr. Pronto, thank you very much for being here with us, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for this very nice invitation. I'm very happy to do this, and thank you to the American Society, which, by the way, I've been a member since 1997, I think. And this is a great opportunity, and I'm very excited by the fact that the Society is keen on sharing information to young scholars, and I'm happy to participate in this series. So what I propose to do is talk about how I got here, my background, because I know that I get asked very often by students, how did you get there, and what did you do to get to the United Nations? Then talk a little bit about what we do, what I do, what others do in my office. I am not the only principal legal officer. There are a few of us, but I work in a particular area, as you referred to already. And then I thought I'd maybe close off by some sort of just general tips about pursuing careers in international law, and more specifically at an international organization like the United Nations, and looking at from the perspective of someone who's gone that path, traveled through all the different sort of career hoops to get here, but also from the perspective of a manager. I'm involved in hiring, and I know some of the decisions and sort of the considerations. So, to the extent that I can share those, I certainly, will be happy to do so. So what I thought as I said, I'd do first is talk a little bit about, how I got here. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there is no sort of special background per se. People come from very, very different backgrounds and end up working here at the UN. In fact, that's part of what's sort of magical about this place, is that there's such a diversity of backgrounds and experiences, and that if I can make it here, anybody can really make it here. I am South African. It's my background. I am from Johannesburg. I am of Portuguese extraction from Southern Africa, but more specifically, I grew up in Johannesburg. I went to the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where I got my law degrees, and I studied at a time of great change in my country, and it was a very exciting time. And it was a time when many of us lawyers, starting in our careers, were thinking about doing things different than just going to law firms, as most careers pursued. And I got very interested in human rights work, something that was very big at that time, and that took me into the international law world. I ended up studying with John Dugard, who at the time was the international law professor at Wits University in Johannesburg, and it was very inspirational in taking up a career in international law. There were a few steps along the way involving human rights courses here and there in Strasbourg and so on. I then subsequently found myself at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy up in Boston doing a master's degree, which, by the way, is great training ground for UN people. There are many, many UN people have gone through the Fletcher route. It's really tailored in a sense for this type of international career. And it was somewhere along that way that I decided that actually international law was something that I was interested in. I thought I was going to work in the human rights world, more specifically perhaps for an NGO or something like that, as I had been involved in this kind of work back in my country. But there was always that international component to it, and that I found myself more and more interested in that aspect of the work. My law school thesis was on the rights of indigenous peoples under international law, and so I got more and more into that area, and that's what actually took me to the Fletcher School. The point I'm trying to make here is that sometimes you start somewhere and you go along and you find that the path takes you in a different direction that you may not have expected. And this happens, and it happens very often. The important part is to start that path, pursuing and see where things take you. What happened at the time was that there was a bunch of us at the Fletcher School who applied as to be interns at the UN. And we all got in and came to the United Nations in New York. Now, I have to say that coming from South Africa, from the bottom end of the world, it had never really crossed my mind that maybe a career at the United Nations might be something to pursue. It was just lack of information, awareness, and so on. But pursuing these steps brought me to the United Nations, brought me, in fact, to an internship, as I said, here at the UN in the Office of Legal Affairs. And I became aware of what was going on, what it was like, what was the nature of the work, and suddenly a possibility of working at the UN opened up in my horizon. I was also particularly fortunate that the timing was right, that I went through what was then called the National Competitive Exam. Now it's called the Young Professionals Program. And I went through that exam. It so happened that my country was up for that exam. Now, I'll come back to that at the end in sort of the third segment when we talk about how to get at the UN and so on. But I came through that process and joined in... I joined officially in 1998, but I was a consultant here, in fact, in 1997. So I'm approaching the 20-year mark. And as you say, I've been working here as a public international lawyer in the codification division since then. The path, I did this at the time when there was no internet, or it was very much in its infancy, right? So it was all about serendipity, about meeting people along the way, about timing, this kind of stuff. But I think that, and I'll get back to this in a second, that the internet has also changed things a lot. There's a lot more information out there, and has opened up the world of opportunities. But I always recall this story about how I came from, because I very often hear from students who come from very far away. I had just an Australian just the other day reaching out to me asking about how to get to the United Nations, because the distance is not only just a space, it's also in our minds, right? It just seems so far away. And the point I'm trying to make is that if I could make it here, anybody else could make it here. So what I want to do now is shift to the second part and talk about Office of Legal Affairs. Is there anything else you might want me to talk about, how I got here, or shall I proceed to the next step?
Maybe if you can just tell us, if you had another chance, would you choose this career? Would you have pursued another path if you would not be interested in human rights law? Would it be any other way for you to realize your goal?
No, I think not. I really enjoy what I do. I think I'm a big proponent of doing something you love doing, especially with law. Law can be very mundane, very boring. I always joke that I can't imagine waking up in the morning and looking at the tax code all day, right? Because it's just not something of interest to me. But the world needs tax lawyers. I think and there are people who are excited about the tax code, and that's great. I think what is important is to do something that excites you, that wakes you up. Every morning you wake up excited to go and do. And it's important to find that. And it's important to know what it is that really interests you and really pursue it. And no, so the answer is no. I don't. I was pretty lucky because I was relatively easy because of the timing. There was a lot of serendipity. I know of a lot of people who have struggled because it's very competitive, as I'll talk about later on, or the timing was off and so on. I think it's one door opens, leads to another door, and so on, and that's how it happened with me. So I would certainly not have chosen a more difficult path. I do sometimes wonder what it may have been like if I had pursued the human rights more fully. I do a little bit of human rights in my area, but I don't work, primarily. But I don't sense it as a loss. I think of it as part of my background, sort of the richness of my experience is to have a different background that I bring to my knowledge and my work that I do, and the human rights background really gives me that richness, that and some other stuff that I do. And so, no, I think it's fine. But I would always recommend that, as I say, be happy with what you do, or push, go to the next one until you find something that you really enjoy doing. So, because I do enjoy this work, I wouldn't have gone a different way, no. All right.
Well, transitioning to the second part of when you're talking about what is day-to-day tasks at the UN, I wanted just to ask, what is the most rewarding part of your job? What is the most rewarding part?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a lot. It's a combination of intellectually stimulating, as I'll explain shortly. I mean, I really enjoy working in the law. And in my particular area, we're making new law. So we're pushing the law forward in a way. We're developing new areas. And it's very challenging. It's very exciting. Of course, working at the United Nations is itself a very stimulating experience. I mean, it can be frustrating at times, as all jobs are. But the United Nations played a really tremendous role in the history of my country, and the ability to, in a sense, give back, to now it's our turn, in a sense, to contribute to the United Nations. It's a tremendous honor, and so that is just in itself something that's stimulating. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on, that work that I've been doing that's personally very satisfying. I've just finished 10 years work on the protection of persons in the event of disasters that I was very involved in from the very inception. I mean, it's personally satisfying, professionally satisfying that they're involved in work that will affect people's lives throughout the world, including in my area, from my part of the world. That brings with it a tremendous amount of satisfaction. We don't get compensated like if you work in a law firm, but the compensation comes in other ways, and it's through the ability to serve and give back, in a sense. And I think we're all very lucky and very privileged to work in the cause of international law, you and I and others that are following this. I think that in itself is a tremendous experience and luck. And so I think if we keep that in mind, as we trudge through the daily, slog of work, as all jobs have, it's important to keep that perspective, that we are particularly fortunate to be where we are. Yeah. Should I talk a little bit about the Office of Legal Affairs and what I do? Yeah. So the Office of Legal Affairs then is the main office of the United Nations Secretariat, right? We are headed by the Legal Counsel of the United Nations, Miguel Cepa Suarez. He is the Undersecretary General as well of the office, so it's the head of the Office of Legal Affairs, and he reports directly to the Secretary General. But more than that, he is the legal counsel of the entire United Nations, so he has that separate status as the legal counsel. We are, and let me preface this by saying that we're not the only legal office in the United Nations, but we're perhaps the main legal office. What I will do now is just quickly explain what the legal office, how it's sort of organized, what the different units do and everything, then focus on my unit and my job in particular. And then perhaps, and don't let me forget, I could also talk a little bit about some of the other legal offices that I'm referring to. So the Office of Legal Affairs is, I believe, 5 units, if I'm not counting it wrong. The main one, well, the first one, rather, I would like to talk about is the Office of the Legal Counsel. So it's the office that sort of surrounds the legal counsel, and they are headed by our assistant Secretary General Steve Mathias, and they do very crudely, and I apologize already in advance to all of my colleagues who might watch this, that I don't accurately explain what they do, but somewhat simply, they do the legal aspects of political issues, right? So there's a tremendous amount of work being generated by the United Nations itself, by the Security Council, by the General Assembly, and there's a lot of legal aspects. So the way I explain it is that what they'll have on their shelves are books about, they will have the Charter, books about the Charter, legal commentaries of the Charter. The organization, as you're aware, is very involved in areas of the world where there's armed conflict. So it's a sign of our times. So IHL is a very big part of the work of the organization, and sort of the operationalization of IHL. And so my colleagues tend to be very involved in IHL affairs, in international criminal law aspects and issues like that. And so they will have that kind of expertise, that kind of knowledge. They will have those types of books, it's how I describe it, on their shelves. And they also deal with things like the procedural aspects. The UN is a giant meeting mechanism, and there's a lot of rules of procedure, and they advise on that. So they are very involved in the rules of procedure of the General Assembly, the provisional rules for the Security Council, and providing advice. They will also advise other parts of the UN, on procedural aspects and decisions and so on. Any legal questions that are that arise within the organization can be addressed to the legal counsel, who then prepare an opinion with the support of his officers in the Office of the Legal Counsel, or the colleagues in the General Legal Division, which I'll get to in a second. They're also very involved in liaison. There's a lot of interaction within the organization. The organization is very, very broad, a lot of parts. So, for example, liaison with the International Court of Justice is done through the Office of Legal Counsel and so on. Liaison with other entities like the International Criminal Court, very involved. That office was very involved in the establishment of the ad hoc tribunals and the other criminal mechanisms, providing advice along the way, and serving as liaison with those entities. So that's, you get a sense of the type of work of that, right? It's very much the bread and butter of the United Nations, of a very broad range of work that a global organization like the United Nations performs. And so it gives rise to a tremendous amount of legal work, and they're very involved in that sort of very cutting edge work. Then I go across to the General Legal Division, and they are our, again, rather crudely put, our in-house counsel. They will do lots of contractual type stuff. The UN it's a huge procurement exercise that goes on with each peacekeeping mission, for example. There's a lot of contractual work with private sector partners, with other organizations, and so on. And it's policing these contracts and really working them out. There are a lot of entities in the UN that want to partner with other organizations, entities, private sector partners. All of those agreements have to be cleared and looked at and so on. There are also some of these arrangements end up in disputes, and so there is dispute work as well, arbitration and this kind of stuff that they're involved. There's very little by way of litigation in courts because of the immunities of the organization, but that doesn't mean that there's no dispute settlement. It just means that dispute settlement is done in a different way through arbitration and so on. So there are colleagues there that are very involved in that kind of work. Also, the UN has a very extensive and very broad administrative framework, internal administrative, the administrative tribunal, and this generates a tremendous amount of work. And so my colleagues there are very involved in what is essentially international administrative law, and representing the organization in numerous cases before these tribunals. And so they have a particular expertise in that. And there's a range of other very niche type things. So, for example, the intellectual property, the logo and the emblem of the United Nations. There's a body of intellectual property law just developed around the logo of the organization. So the question of whether logos, the emblem, sorry, can be used, on a poster or on some sort of campaign, has all of the stuff, the rules around that. The organization also functions internally. It has its own internal rules, which are developed through a series of administrative instructions and Secretary General bulletins and so on, regulating everything from my salary to the staff conduct and so on. And all of these regulations and rules are looked at, revised, interpreted by my colleagues in the General Legal Division. And I have come nowhere close to doing justice to what they do, but you get a sense of it, right? They are in-house counsel. And one thing also I may mention is that they are sort of the backstopping office. There are lots of units, legal units throughout the organization in the programs. For example, UNDP has its own little legal office, and so DPKO, the peacekeeping department, has its own little unit of lawyers, and so those units will tend to do the day-to-day stuff, and then if they need advice from sort of the main office, there's some issue, they will refer it to the Office of Legal Affairs for sort of the backstopping kind of thing. And so those colleagues in the General Legal Division do a lot of those functions. And they will also then, as I said earlier on, they will advise the legal counsel on any questions that may require their input in providing legal advice on legal opinions to the Secretary General or to bodies of the organization and so on, as requested. Then, so now I am looking at this geographically where they're located. So I move across to the treaty section, which is again a distinct unit of the Office of Legal Affairs. And now here, the treaty section has two main functions. There's a third as well, actually. Under Article 102 of the Charter, all states are required to register their treaties with the United Nations, all the member states. And the philosophy here is, in the Charter, is to move to a world of written law and of greater transparency, so that they move away from secret treaties and unwritten law. And so this is the source then of the United Nations Treaty Series, which has produced in the tens of thousands of treaties. And so my colleagues in the treaty section are responsible for the registration functions and the production of the United Nations Treaty Series. And there's this huge amount of work there. The second thing that they do is that the Secretary General is designated as the depository for several hundred major treaties, talking all the human rights treaties, all the big ones, the Rome Statute, the Paris Agreement, a bunch of the disarmament treaties, a lot of the environmental treaties. They have this great website. You can go there and see all the treaties. But the important thing is that we need to know what is the status of the treaties in terms of how many parties and which countries are parties and which aren't, and so on. So all of these depository functions then are done by the treaty section. And so if a state wants to come to deposit its instrument of ratification or come to sign a particular treaty, they will come to the treaty section and perform those actions. The treaty section, then the third sort of function they do is they're involved in training as well. There's a lot of capacity building that the United Nations do, that Secretariat does, in assisting foreign ministries, particularly in smaller countries and in developing countries, to develop their internal capacity to process treaties and do this kind of work. And so they are more and more involved in that kind of work. And as I said earlier on, the kind of stuff, what they'll have on their shelf is the that have the law of treaties, the commentaries on the law of treaties, and so on. Like my colleagues in the general legal division will have, commercial stuff, more contract law type textbooks and things like that. My colleagues in the treaty section will have commentaries on the Vienna Convention, for example, and this kind of work. There's really hardcore treaty law. Then I move across to the division of ocean affairs and law of the sea, the acronym. And if anyone wants to work at the UN, you have to get used to acronyms, and their acronym is DWALOS, Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. And you really get a sense of what that's about. It's a very specialized unit established after the conclusion of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982, and it's there to really perform a wide range of secretariat functions under that convention, primarily under that convention, but there's some broader things that they do too. So there's a bunch of entities that are set up under that convention, the Commission on the continental shelf and so on. And they perform the various secretariat functions, helping these entities to meet and to do their work. They are very involved in developing new areas of the law of the sea. And so there's a treaty negotiation that's starting on marine biological resources. And they're very involved in that work. They produce an annual report of the Secretary General that is sort of the A to Z of everything on the law of the sea that year. So everything from fisheries to the high seas to the deep sea bed and so on. Everything you need to know about the law of the sea happens there. They will also provide very technical functions. States that are parties to the UNCLOS come to the United Nations to get assistance in delimiting, for example, like the continental shelf between them, using the rules under the convention and so on. And this is a service that the United Nations provides to member states that wish to do that. There are a bunch of submission requirements under the convention where states submit their information about their delimitation and so on. And that comes to our colleagues in DWALOS for processing and for circulating to other member states and so on. So again, it's if for someone who's very interested in the law of the sea, and this is really a growing area of the law, as we human beings are increasingly exploiting or developing the technology to exploit the seas. With it comes a whole bunch of legal issues, and so this is an area of great interest. I would say increasing interest. The work on the law of the sea and in fisheries and so on is actually dealt with in the General Assembly, in the plenary of the General Assembly, which is an indication of how important this is for member states. And there's an annual resolution that is negotiated that has many paragraphs dealing with all kinds of different aspects of the law of the sea. And so it's a big area that the Office of Legal Affairs is involved in. And of course, on their shelves, they've got law of the sea textbooks and really stuff like that. They're international lawyers, but with a particular focus. And so I shift to another group of international lawyers, also with a particular focus, and that's my colleagues that are in International Law, Trade Law Division, ITLD, based in Vienna. And that's the only unit of the Office of Legal Affairs that's outside of New York. We're all headquartered in New York, even though we move to different places in the world at different points in time, with the exception of the colleagues in Vienna, ITLD, and they come to New York from time to time, so they come the opposite direction. And as you can already from the name, you can get a sense that their focus is trade law, and this is not WTO, GATT type trade law. It's more international commercial law, and so they service the UNCITRAL, the UN Commission on International Trade Law, which is very involved in developing a whole series of instruments, texts, and so on on different areas of international commercial law and so on. And so they were instrumental in the development of the New York Convention, and there's a series of things that they're involved in now. A lot of the electronic commerce and so on, developing new texts, and also they're very involved in updating prior texts, revising And I say this because this is increasingly a focus of progressive development and codification work of the United Nations, is actually not only developing new law, but revising previously adopted law. And so they're involved in that in the commercial law context. And they are also very, very involved in capacity building. But again, for smaller countries, developing countries, providing advice on national legislation and so on, to develop and they develop model rules and guidelines and so on that member states might wish to adopt to modernize their national legislation and so on in the commercial law area. And then the last unit is my unit. I'm in the codification division, as you said earlier on. And we do essentially three areas. We are a servicing unit in the sense that we help run the meetings of the legal bodies of the United Nations, or some of the legal bodies. Particularly, we are the secretariat of the 6th Committee of the General Assembly, which is the legal committee, and that's sort of the policy-making committee where the member states meet and take the bigger decisions on the bigger issues of international law. And we are also the secretariat of the International Law Commission, which is now an expert body of independent legal experts. There's a lot of cross-fertilization between the two. So we will spend our summers in Geneva at the International Law Commission, and then the autumn or the fall, depending on how you look at it, here in New York at the meeting of the 6th Committee. And so we are the bridge in a sense between the two. And what does servicing mean? It means everything from actually helping to run the meetings, organizing, sort of the mechanics of it, liaising with the other parts of the secretariat that provide interpretation and conference management and the translation of documents and so on. We don't do that ourselves, but we are the interface with those parts of the secretariat that take care of those things. That's sort of the technical secretariat aspects. To the substantive secretariat, we are in public international lawyers, so ourselves, and we have many of us have more of an academic background. We write the studies, the Secretary General reports ourselves, or at least most of them, that provide essentially the food for the debate, the discussion in the 6th Committee, and some of the reports for the International Law Commission. The International Law Commission has its own special rapporteurs that produce their own reports, but we also, from time to time, are asked to prepare background studies and this kind of stuff. With the Commission, we're much more substantively involved in providing legal advice, working very closely with special rapporteurs. So we will provide, we will comment on reports, we will help drafting of reports, we will be involved in drafting of commentaries, and so it's very substantive work. But it's so there too, we help run the meetings in Geneva, making sure that things happen on time, scheduling, sort of the whole sort of technical stuff, but also the substantive. We sit in the drafting committee. That's one of the things that I do as the secretary of the drafting committee of the International Law Commission for the topics that I cover, and then writing the report of the drafting committee, and then the report of the commission itself. We're all involved, us here in the secretariat, different officers do different topics, and we prepare that report that everybody reads. So we're the ones to blame for the lengthy report with lots of footnotes. And then the Commission then adopts that report, and of course it doesn't have to accept everything we write. They can change it just through the adoption process. So it's very much a collaborative process. So that's the servicing aspect of it, and it involves, as I said, also preparing Secretary General reports that go to the 6th Committee, then are considered by the member states, and on the basis of those reports, the member states take decisions and drafting of draft resolutions that get then adopted by the GA a bit later on. The second thing, sort of main area that we are involved in is dissemination of information, and that traditionally that means preparing publications with a series of ongoing, recurring international law publications. So we prepare the UN Juridical Yearbook, an annual yearbook on everything that's going on at the UN in the legal field. We are involved in the reports of international arbitral awards. We are responsible for those reports. We have the summaries of the International Court of Justice. We're working with the summaries of the judgments, and then these are translated members, because the court's documents are not always in all 6 languages, but we help facilitate providing access to the information of the International Court by having it translated into 6 languages. And these are then published in books and so on. The Repertory of Practice is another publication that we were involved in. So this is a bit of a plug for our publications, if you don't mind. And all of this, by the way, is online. And that's the other aspect of it, is that we are disseminating more and more over the internet. We have websites for the legal bodies that we service. We have websites for the publications that we produce, all with full text search. And then we also have the Audiovisual Library of International Law, which is the main sort of big website that we have. Essentially a training tool over the internet for international lawyers. It's really geared towards international lawyers in developing countries. Again, you get the common theme, right? That the capacity building in developing countries is something that the UN is very, very involved in. And we, as international lawyers, are very committed to that idea that as international lawyers here at the UN, that it's good for the long-term health of international law, that there is greater interest and capacity in international law in small countries around the world, and that international law is not only for conflicts between the big powers, but it's also a language of transaction, to communicate, to resolve disputes, also between small countries in all corners of the world. And so we're very committed to sharing this information and building this capacity. And so the internet has really helped us really extend our reach really into the furthest corners of the world. And the Audiovisual Library is one of the examples of what we do. There, the Audiovisual Library really has 3 pillars. The most well-known one is that we have been video recording quite a few very prominent international lawyers. We get them when they come here to New York, or when we see them in Europe. We ask them to come and sit in front of a camera and to talk about their particular area of expertise for an hour or so. And we then put that on the internet free of charge. And the idea there is that it's important, it's really good for an international lawyer, let's say in Africa or in Asia, to hear James Crawford give his take on state responsibility, for example. It really flattens the educational experience and gives access really to everybody. And so we have several hundred of these videos, and we have more in the pipeline already recorded, and some others planned. And we intend to continue doing this work and expanding it and making it available in different media, both through the internet video, but also through sound as well. It's a new area that we're moving in, where people can just download the sound in those parts of the world where internet access is still a bit difficult. And I must say, it's personally very satisfying to get questions over by email from PhD students, sort of a student in the countryside in Egypt, asking very detailed questions about the International Law Commission's work on navigational uses of watercourses, for example. It's tremendous that there are people who have access to that information through our websites. The second pillar is our we have a research library where we have access to some materials that are freely available online through some partnerships that we've been able to put, so to supplement students throughout the world who do not have access to very extensive libraries of international law. We've been providing this sort of link to online materials, and then we have a part of the audiovisual library where we've digitized UN materials, old sound, video, photographs, and we've built it around particular treaties, sort of provide a visual travaux, in a sense, of the work around the covenants, the two human rights covenants, for example, or even things like the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have, Eleanor Roosevelt, introducing the draft of the Universal Declaration. We found this material in our archives, and literally in the basement of the UN. And we spent a tremendous amount of time and some money to digitize all of these materials. And then through an army, a very extensive army of interns, all of which we're very grateful. And if some are watching, hello and thank you very much. We developed a series of products, in a sense, around each of these instruments with access, to these audiovisual materials. And then we've asked prominent international lawyers to write a note, sort of an explanatory note about it. What's the significance of that treaty, and why should we, care really about this instrument on it? And then also we have, with information, like all the sort of background research information, all the list of documents and when things happen, timelines, and so on. And again, it's a research tool. And so that's our focus of our website, is really develop a research tool for international lawyers. And we try to put it in as interesting a way as possible. So with text searches, the ability to search across the websites and so on, so that it provides a more interesting experience. And let me say, we are seeing it in the numbers. We have to track users and so on, and we get users literally from every member state of the United Nations. It's across the world, and we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of unique users. So they are, if someone asks, how many international lawyers are there out there, we have an idea. It's in the several hundred thousands that are interested, at least in international law. The last thing we do is sort of an extension of this dissemination work then, is that we teach. We have a series of, or more specifically, we're involved in training in international law, which involves a little bit of teaching on our part, but we also bring prominent international lawyers to come and teach. We have 3 regional courses in international law per year in Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific. And then we have a fellowship program at The Hague that happens at the same time as the Hague Academy. And so those are sort of 4 courses, in a sense, per year that take place. And we're very involved in organizing those courses. Everything from the curriculum, who's going to come, all the technical stuff in the background, and we may ourselves be involved in giving some of the training. And it's training that's focused primarily, again, at building capacity in ministries and governments, building that training in public international law. It's very important in our mind to have officials in ministries who are involved in decisions related about treaty or international law, to have some exposure to training by prominent international lawyers on the law of treaties, on the state responsibility, and so on. And so we do this then through a combination then of the training courses plus the online materials that we have. So this is very much so. An international lawyer then in this division would work with a foot in everything. Depending on the time of the year, they may be involved in drafting a Secretary General's report for the Sixth Committee, or a study for the International Law Commission. At a different time of the year, they may be going to one of the courses, say in Thailand or in Africa, in Addis Ababa, to help run the thing. And then at a different time of the year, they may be in Geneva at the International Law Commission, helping to write the reports of the meetings, what happened, advising special rapporteurs, or towards the end of the year being in the Sixth Committee of the General Assembly. And I'm involved in all of these. I'm involved personally in sort of managing this process, in providing guidance, It's a mix between more technical kind of work in terms of, as I say, this guidance type work, administrative type work, and also substantive work. I write some of those reports myself or with teams. We tend to work in the UN anyway in teams of people, and so someone who works in my division can expect to work in several teams. So a team dedicated to a particular publication, a team to a training on a particular training course, and a team on servicing, for example. So it's that mix. And so on our shelves, on my shelves, I will have public international law textbooks, really, and sort of general public international law textbooks. We have all sort of the big ones. And then, we'll also, depending on the particular area that we're working in. So I'm involved in the work on provisional application of treaties. Right now, that's sort of the area that I'm looking in. Just finished, as I said earlier, on the work on disasters. So I had to really familiarize myself with a very, very new area that's very new to international law. So that kind of work involved. And from time to time, I do get to do human rights stuff. There are human rights components. I was involved in the early days when I first joined in the International Criminal Court, and I literally joined this division was a secretariat for the Rome process, for the Rome conference, because the International Criminal Court work came from the International Law Commission, right? So it was from the Commission to the Sixth Committee, and from the Sixth Committee to the Diplomatic Conference. We were the secretariat in all three steps. I arrived literally as just before everybody was heading off to Rome to the conference. I didn't go to the conference, but I was here post-Rome, the Preparatory Commission, and setting up the court, and then the secretariat left from the UN to create its own secretariat. That's when I ended. I was also involved early on in international terrorism work, where through the Sixth Committee, the negotiation of a series of anti-terrorism treaties, and the ones on bombings, financing of terrorism, and nuclear terrorism. I was involved in those three, and that's sort of my early work is in that area, and all of that work, the ICC and the terrorism work, had human rights components to it. And having a human rights background, I found myself contributing in that process, being asked to contribute, the human rights sort of dimension to that work. After that, I've moved primarily into the International Law Commission that I've been, as you said earlier on, since 1999, and I continue to be in the International Law Commission. Worked primarily on state responsibility, then diplomatic protection, responsibility of international organizations, effects of armed conflicts on treaties, protection of persons in the event of disasters, provisional application of treaties, and use codons now as well. That's a rather lengthy explanation of our work. Have I covered everything? Is there anything you may want to know more about my work?
A lot. I learned so many things I did not know before. I just wanted to ask maybe, what is the busiest period for you in the year? I know Sixth Committee sits in the fall. You said you're very busy in the fall, but perhaps there's also another period that keeps you very busy. And another question I had, my personal curiosity, do you choose by yourself the topics you work on, or are they the topics assigned to you?
Right. So, yes. So two questions: what is the busiest times of the year, and then how the topics are assigned. So yes, the year can be roughly split into three sort of segments. The beginning of the year, where we are right now, the first, say, 4 months of the year, 4 to 5 months of the year, are report writing months. We do a little bit of servicing. We have a committee called the Special Committee on the Charter, that is another subsidiary body of the General Assembly. In fact, it meets next week. It starts next week. So there's some servicing work there. But this time of the year is primarily report writing, because it works in a cycle. And so the reports that we're going to write, we write now. And also, by the way, we receive the reports of the special rapporteurs around now. And we are commenting on those reports, going back and forth. Sometimes special rapporteurs ask us to chase footnotes or to close out a particular section that they need some information on for us to comment. There's this sort of work that's going on right now. And all of those have to be submitted relatively soon because they're very lengthy and they have to be translated in time in order to be issued in time for the meeting in the summer. So that's the kind of busyness that we have right now. And then there are those colleagues that are going to the courses. There is a course that's going on right now, in fact, as well. And then so they're in a sort of in a different cycle that they are there. Then in the middle of the year here in New York, but it's very busy in Geneva. We are at International Law Commission, and that's very heavy period for us because the commission's very intense, 10 to 12 weeks of the year with a lot of, and they do it in two parts, but which is in May and July. But it means that June is also a big heavy time for preparing the documents for the second part. So in effect, it's 3 months of work in the summertime done in Geneva. Now, we don't all go for 10 or 12 weeks. We do share. So we were split it depending on when the topics are being considered. So if my topics are being considered in the first few weeks, I will go during those first few weeks, come back to New York, and then I'll be replaced by the colleague who does the next set of topics and so on. So it is spread that way, but it means that any follow-up work that I have on the topics that I've been covering would be done here in New York as opposed to being in Geneva. It's just shift from place to place, but it's a particularly busy time. And then the third part segment is October, and there is some preparatory work really in September for the sixth committee into sort of organizational work, but it's primarily in October into early November that the sixth committee. So it's those 3 periods. Quite practically, it means people have time to take holidays and spend time with their family in August and December, and that's it. Maybe a little bit in March, sort of in between, sort of the shoulder periods in between these big timing. But it's a cycle, because then what happens is then the sixth committee will consider the report of the International Law Commission, as well as the various Secretary General reports for some of the other topics that it's discussing, and then it will discuss it, come to sort of some sort of decision that will be reflected in a draft resolution that will be recommended to the GA. The GA adopts those in December, and that's the mandate, the authority for us to start the work for the next year. So the next cycle starts in January. And we produce the next round of reports for the following General Assembly and the following ILC. And so it goes in a cyclical pattern. That is relatively unique to my division.